What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind? Frost cracked like thin glass under her boots. The air tasted of iron and old hay, a smell that clung to the throat and sat there like a memory. Dawn was a pale bruise on the horizon. The barracks stood silent, low and yawning, its windows black with winter breath. She had expected silence to be empty. Instead, it was heavy, full of the shapes of things not yet named. She moved slow as if nervous movement might wake the past. Fingers tucked into the cuffs of a too large coat. Each small motion, tucking hair behind an ear, pulling a glove tighter, meant nothing and everything. Grief does not roar. It tends to its own small rituals. The reheating of coffee past the point of pleasure, the folding of shirts she could not yet put away, the way hands reach for a doorknob and pause. The horse existed before she saw it. She felt first the loss in the way the building seemed to breathe around them, and then the thing that was larger than loss, a presence that shaped the air. A warm, even exhalation came from somewhere behind a half door. There was a slight rasp, like a book's spine when it opens. Then a nostril flare and the soft, impatient click of hooves shifting on concrete. From the corner, he looked like a silhouette someone had sketched and then left to dry, not magnificent in the romantic, parade-ready way of cavalry posters. He was a workhorse of memory, rib lines softened by winter, a coat dulled with the dust of an old life, one ear always fractionally angled. His mane was cropped in the old army cut, short, blunt, but a small curl had escaped near his forehead, and when the light hit it, it was almost obscene, like a secret kept of gentleness. She did not introduce herself. There was no script for this moment, no polite exchange. She stood at the threshold of an old stall and listened to the horse name the room, a series of breaths, a clumsy stamping, an exclamation of wind across an empty water bucket. He judged her not with a human's logic, but by the language he understood, posture, scent, the way a body arrives. He tilted his head, a small calculation, and then exhaled a breath that fogged the air between them. She reached for the door as if to close it. Habit, protection, an inward gesture that meant subtly, I am not ready. The animal watched the move and took it in. Horses live in steps in sequence. There is comfort in a repeated circuit. When she lifted her hand to the latch, he shifted so the near side of his shoulder pressed softly against the wood. And the gesture lodged in her like something she had been waiting for. He smelled of soldiers and saddle leather, of damp straw and the particular salt of a horse who had known hard hands and kinder ones. When he stepped his head over the edge of the partition, careful as if the world were a conversation and he did not want to interrupt, she felt something in her chest rotate, simple and startling. The slow, confidential awareness of another living thing that bore the same worn edges as she did. She crouched without thinking, knees folding in on themselves. It was not a dramatic gesture. There were no theatrics, no sudden collapse, just the motion of a person who had been learning to bend to the world again. He came closer by inches, nostrils opening, whiskers brushing the sleeve of her coat. The hairs of his muzzle were rough against the fabric. He sniffed the air, exploring, her scent a new punctuation in his known language. For a moment he tasted only the salt and smoke of her life. Then faintly, something shifted in him. An acceptance, like the settling of a chair someone had been standing by. She offered him nothing, only stillness. In the stilled space between two breaths, it felt like an offering. He lowered his head and touched her palm with the side of his nose, a careful, bright pressure that traveled up her arm and settled behind her ribs. Tears came unannounced, small and hot, tracking along the paths of a face that had kept itself composed for months. She did not wipe them away. She let the salt of them be, and the horse leaned his head a fraction more as if in approval. There were small things about him that would not be explained by any telling. The way he flared his nostrils when thunder memory was near, the slight favoring of a hind leg that betrayed years of carrying weight and doing it without complaint, a faint scar through one eyebrow, a thin white line like lightning that suggested a story she did not yet know how to read. He watched everything with the slow gravity of an animal used to waiting. Animals keep time differently. They do not hurry grief, they witness it. She learned his ways by watching the small circuits he made in the stall. He would pace once, then pause at a strip of sunlight that fell through a crack as if marking the hour. He liked the lower corner of his hayrack, the place where the older straw accumulated and smelled like a summer long kept in winter. Sometimes he would snort at the echo of an old radio in the empty corridor. And sometimes he would stand for a very long time, staring into the space where the doorway met the sky. It felt to her like someone considering a photograph they could not yet place. On the third morning, she brought an old blanket, the kind wrapped around family quilts and secreted at the back of closets. It smelled faintly of detergent and of a woman who used to make their coffee too strong. He came when she called, not with boyish impatience, but with a careful gait that tested distance. When she draped it over his back, he seemed to inhale the scent and then to exhale something like approval. It settled between them like a treaty. Connection did not snap into being. It curved, patient and unadorned. She found herself speaking into low spaces, words barely more than syllables, names, dates, small things she had not said aloud to anyone. The horse listened with a softness that was not pity. It was something more dangerous, attention. Attention is a pressure that can rearrange a person. He accepted her presence the way the earth accepts rain. There were nights she left the lamp burning in the corridor. The way his profile filled the doorway sometimes kept her awake. She would stand on the other side of the stable and watch the shadow of him move, imagining the balance of muscle and memory beneath that dark. Once, when the wind took a particular angle and a shutter banged, he snorted and the sound threaded through her like a needle. She surprised herself by walking into the stall without plan and resting her forehead against his neck. He did not startle. He did not move away. He stood enormous and gentle, and let the small of her head find that particular hollow behind his shoulder where confessions feel safe. There were questions that sat at the edge of every step. Who had he belonged to before the barracks emptied and the world went quiet? Why had he been left? How did a thing once marched and paraded through crowds become a ghost in a building that wanted to be remembered? The horse carried an old dignity, not the showy kind, but the quiet endurance of someone who had been useful for a lifetime and was learning to be useful to someone else. The first time he followed her out of the stable, her heart moved before her feet. She had been careless. She had meant only to close the door and leave him safe in the warm dark. He rose his head as she turned, and then he moved, slow at first, tail sweeping like a soft hand. He kept to the edge of the yard, watching her face as if testing whether she was done walking away. She took 2 steps, then 3, and when she did, he followed. He did not come close enough to be intrusive. He simply matched the rhythm of her departure, a quiet insistence that asked nothing more than to be noticed. She left the yard that evening, wondering who had walked away first. It stayed with her. He watched corners differently now. There were places in the barracks where the light pooled like memory, and whenever she lingered there, he would stand with his head tipped just so, as if tracking the shape of what she avoided. Small things betrayed him. The shallow, impatient snort when a distant truck rolled by that smelled faintly of diesel and uniforms. The sudden prick of his ears at the echo of a boot on concrete. Those were not ghosts for him, only signals in the world. For her, they were detonations. The first oddity came with a smell. Oil and tobacco and the faint metallic tang of metals. She had been sweeping the tack room, an almost ridiculous ritual of order, when her broom brushed a seam in the floor where the wood had been planed and refitted many times. There, tucked under a loose board, was a folded sheet of paper wrapped in brown twine. Her fingers paused on the twine before they uncoiled it, as if the act of revealing might change the room's temperature. Inside was a letter. Ink faded the same way voices fade in the mind. The handwriting was cramped, practical. It addressed no one by name, only initials and a date years back. A winter like the one she stood in. The letter spoke not of orders or parades, but of small, human things. A horse that liked the sun on his haunches, a shared cigarette between shifts, the way a winter coat could be patched and still be the warmest thing on a tired body. The last line was a single sentence that folded into itself like a prayer. Take care of him if I do not come back. Her breath left the room like a thing hollowed out. The paper trembled in her hand. The horse, who had been dozing by the door with one eye half open, lifted his head. He moved to stand between her and the doorway, not aggressively but possessively, like a friend putting an arm around a stranger's shoulders in a train station. She realized then that the phrase, "if I do not come back," was not distant grammar. It had been a promise made to a thing with a warm muzzle and patient eyes. The letter had been waiting to find the person who could carry it forward. After the letter, strange habits took on shape. The horse reacted to certain words. March, home, dawn. Not with the trained obedience of drills, but with the muscle memory of association. When she spoke the name she found in the letter, simple consonants, no ceremony, He would lower his head and blink slowly, a dogged, almost human recognition. There were places he would not go, a corner of the yard where the ground rose like a bruise. When they walked past, he would slow as if someone were standing behind the earth there, watching. She tried to be practical about what she felt. It was easier to sort schedules and feed rations than to admit that the letter had unspooled a thread that ran straight to the hollow inside her chest. There were nights she lay awake and cataloged the fracture lines of her life, the impossibility of returning home, the small betrayals of survival, the way grief expands and rewires a person. The horse, in his narrow way, became a mirror. He made her aware of the parts of herself she had been keeping on pause. The breaking point did not arrive as a single cinematic collapse. It arrived as a patchwork of smaller collapses that assembled into one undeniable thing. On a day when the sky was a bruise of low clouds, she found beneath the saddle rack a leather strap with an insignia, an old cavalry crest, stitched into the leather. It was worn but intact, and beneath it, pressed like a fossil, was a small photograph wrapped in oilcloth. Her fingers opened it with a caution that felt like reverence. The photograph was of two people and a horse, a man with the same blunt crop of hair the letters described, laughing in a way that seemed to push all the edges of his face into sharp light, a woman whose hands rested on the horse's neck, and the horse himself, lighter than, eyes bright, mane catching a sun that was not the current winter's thin light. On the back, in the same hand as the letter, were the words, "For when I can't tell her myself." When she read the words aloud, the sound broke the dam. It was not a theatrical sob. It was the long animal sound of release, the kind of sound that leaves the throat hollow and raw. She let herself fall forward into the tack bench as if it were a boat, and she had finally dropped the anchor. He came to her side without command, and in the way he moved there was a gravity that suggested he was cataloging her pain the way a friend might note a fever. He stood with his nose close to the crown of her head and let his warm breath wash over her face. His flank rested against the bench like the steady hand of someone who will not be moved. She laughed once, a small, ragged noise, and then began to speak. The kind of talking people do when the walls are down and the truth pours through. Names, regrets, the quiet confession that she had not been living so much as treading water. Words spilled without order. They were not tidy, but the presence of the horse turned them into a ritual. He did not do anything dramatic. He simply stayed. He shifted his weight so the rib of his side rubbed against her shoulder, a slow, pulsing contact that felt like a heartbeat, next to a stalled one. The days after were measured in lighter increments. She allowed herself small gestures that had been unthinkable before. The repair of a saddle, the brushing of a flank, the learning of a name for the animal that had been simply the horse until then. In the evenings, they would stand facing the yard while she read the letters aloud, and the horse would listen the way someone listens to an old friend retell a life. Sometimes when she faltered on a line, he would nudge the page with his nose, as if to remind her to continue. Time reshaped them more gently than she expected. Weeks threaded into months and the horse's gait grew steadier. The slight favoring of his hind legs softened as the ground beneath him settled. She found herself sleeping better, the tightness behind her ribs loosening into something that resembled an exhale. It was not a disappearance of grief. Grief reduced itself in volume and found room for other things. The taste of new coffee, the small satisfaction of fixing a broken clasp, the way the horse would lower his head when thunder rolled and press his forehead against the stall wall, as if to steady the world. One afternoon, months after the letter had been found, the horse led her to a place she had never thought to look. He wandered, not with aimless wander, but with a surety that suggested knowledge. They stopped at an old half-buried trunk under the eaves of the barracks, a trunk she had walked past 100 times and never really seen. Inside were photographs, bite-sized documents, and a scarf threaded with a pattern she recognized from the photograph's woman. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the things. Each object was a puzzle piece that, when assembled, made a whole she had been missing, a life not erased, only paused. Whoever had written the letters and stitched the insignia had left markers in case someone cared enough to follow them. She did not feel the old emptiness leave entirely. Loss keeps an echo. But the box and the horse, who had somehow known where it waited, offered a map back to a version of herself that had been smothered under routine. It was small, practical. A life rearranged so that care could be given forward and backward. She found a photo of the man, the woman, and the horse again, and this time she traced the lines of their faces with fingers that knew the geometry of grief better. Something changed on the inside. Not erasure, but the beginning of belonging. On a late spring morning, she led him out into a field that had been waiting for color. He walked with a slow, parading step that held no trumpets but a quiet pride. She sat on a broken stone and watched the way the light fell across his back. And she understood that some promises are kept not in grand gestures but in the small work of showing up. Day after day, hoof after footfall. He had been left behind once. He would not be left again. Sometimes, when the world felt too large and the ache returned, she would stand in the doorway of the old barracks and listen to him breathe. It was a sound as ordinary as rain and as extraordinary as a saved thing. She would think of the letter, the photograph, the trunk, and the person who had not been able to tell his story with words when time was short. The horse had been the carrier of those fragments and, in carrying them, had given her the chance at a different ending than the one she had expected. Sometimes the rescue is not about saving the lost so much as being found by them. He had been a war horse once, marching, hauling, bearing the weight of other people's purposes, and in retirement he had become something else, an insistence that life could be rearranged. She reached out and ran a hand along his shoulder. He pressed his head into her palm and breathed slow, and in that breath there was a peace that was not simple but real. If this story touched you, subscribe, leave a comment, follow, and press the bell icon to watch daily videos and enjoy.